Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters with Jen Parker and my colleague Richard Dunley. We're going to talk about today the developments across the Indo-Pacific, a series of activities, but mostly focus on Australia. But we'll get into that in a sec. Richard, what have you been up to since we spoke?
Hi, Jen, and welcome to our listeners again. We're recording on the Tuesday, the 4th of March. So if anything happens, as seems to be happening all the time at the moment, between then and when this podcast comes out, that's why. So what have I been up to? I think as with everybody else, I've been trying to work out what's going on with the Chinese task group and trying to work out what everyone else thinks is going on with the Chinese task group. I had a piece out in The Conversation that I think in many ways repeated much of what you'd been writing in various different outlets at various points. But that was kind of my tuppence on the issue. You've been all over doing media and left, right and centre.
I have. So I've been in San Francisco, which is probably the exciting thing, talking about maritime domain awareness and talking about underwater domain awareness. For NISA, which is a US think tank as part of their Department of Defense or the National Defense University. So that's really interesting, the idea of how could you cooperate, if you can cooperate on underwater domain awareness within the region. My view is it's probably pretty challenging. And Singapore attempted that 10 years ago. It was unsuccessful, but that was really interesting. Also, as you mentioned, there have been some Chinese ships circumnavigating Australia, which...
if you've managed to miss that, then well done. Congratulations.
Congratulations. I wish I'd missed it. But, you know, we will obviously get into that. But it has meant a lot of writing, a lot of press. So I've had a piece in the Fin Review last week talking about, you know, what are some of the lessons that we should learn from this. And it's really talking about, you know, that constant theme of just investing in maritime and investing in naval capability. And I think that if there are any good parts from last week, there's a lot actually. It has reminded people, one, what an exclusive economic zone is, which we'll get into in the Did You Know? But two, the fact that we have underinvested in our capabilities for decades and we just can't afford to do that. But we'll get into that a little bit more. I had a second piece in the Sydney Morning Herald last week on the same topic of Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia, talking about the idea that if we overreact to this, and we will get into this, but if we overreact in terms of our view on freedom of navigation, on the freedom of the high seas, then actually we hand a propaganda win to China. So they've kind of been my key pieces out. I've also recorded a podcast with Sal from What's Going On with Shipping, so a bit of a cross promotion there. You'll be able to check that out with him. And lots of other things happening. Feels like I haven't spoken to you in a year, to be honest, Richard, given everything that has gone on. In terms of some of the things that have happened, though, we talked about that we're going to focus mainly on Australia today. There have been some things going on in the region that we are parking for today. Of course, we've seen another cable cut in the vicinity of Taiwan, and there's been a lot of information about that. There's also been a Chinese naval exercise, including a live firing in the vicinity of Taiwan. And another one in the Gulf of Tonkin in the vicinity of Vietnam. And a few capability news. I mean, we see that the UK is moving a lot more into remotely controlled and autonomous vessels. There's been some information about their mine clearance capability and also about them moving into uncrewed underwater vehicles. But we are going to park all of that because we do need to talk about these Chinese warships. Richard,
Absolutely.
What has been happening with Chinese warships?
So, as for those of you who've managed to somehow live on a different planet for the past couple of weeks, a Chinese task group, surface action group, so I think it's Task Group 107, has been operating in and around Australia for the past week or so, conducting what now is quite clearly a kind of a circumnavigation of Australia. This force is made up of a large Type 55 cruiser a smaller Type 45, Type 54, frigate, and a replenishment ship. This is quite a significant force, particularly the cruiser is a very powerful warship by all accounts. And it's relatively unusual them operating in these kind of waters. It's not unprecedented, but I think it is fair to say that it is unusual. We saw one of these cruisers in a part of a similar kind of group operating in the South Pacific and going to Vanuatu at the end of last year. But this is something that is certainly not happened regularly. And this got quite a lot of headlines as they entered. They passed they split up and passed kind of on either side of New Guinea, and then entered the Australian EEZ. And there was quite a lot of discussion around when they were in the Australian EEZ, but the issue really blew up over the live fire exercises, which were conducted not actually in the Australian EEZ, but in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. And the question about whether or not they gave appropriate notice because of the disruption that ended up being caused by one of the exercises, at least, to commercial aviation. So effectively, they ended up, and I think we'll probably get you to talk a little bit more about the details here, but they ended up being on the radio to commercial airliners who had no idea what was going on, and saying that effectively they were basically scaring commercial airliners to a degree, and then these airliners had to be diverted. So it caused quite a significant issue in terms of kind of the actual issue itself, and there was a protest to the Chinese government, but particularly in terms of the political dynamics that then have come out from that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the live fire exercise? Because I think you've set this out probably as clearly as anyone has, and then we can come back and talk a little bit more about some of the other elements of this.
Right, yes, the live fire exercise. So I guess, I think it caught a lot of Australia and potentially internationally. In fact, I have an interview with the New York Times in about 30 minutes. So definitely internationally, people on guard in terms of, well, what is this whole idea of ships doing gunnery at sea, right? And I think it's been great in some ways because it has forced a conversation. I mean, what do warships do? And the fact is, warships on long deployments, and this task group is well, now much further, but at the time was some 8,500 kilometers from China, do gunnery serials pretty regularly. Now, sometimes they do them for training, sometimes they do them for currency, sometimes they do them for maintenance, sometimes they do them to make a statement, right? But either way, warships are allowed to do this on the high seas, and it's not uncommon. Of course, we had the reporting that there was a serial on the Friday and a serial on the Saturday about a week and a half ago now. Now, the warships themselves had positioned themselves on the high seas. From some of the reporting, it looks like they moved formation. So normally a task group would be transiting, in some sort of a screen around the high value unit, which would be the tanker in this case, right? It looks like they moved into some sort of formation. It's not clear what formation, but often ships will move into what's called Formation 1, which is basically when they get into a column to prepare for a gunnery serial. And it looks like a target of some sort was deployed. Where the controversy comes from is the fact that when you're planning a medium-range gunnery firing, you can do this on the high seas. As I said, they're really common. But you also need to think about safety to the surface vessels and the aircraft around you. So all ships will have a chart on board them that tells them where the known civilian air routes are. Of course, though, in international airspace, aircraft can fly wherever they like, but there are common air routes that civilian aircraft fly because, to be honest, it's the quickest, easiest, and cheapest way to get there. So normally a warship should position themselves for something like a medium-range gunnery firing, about 10 nautical miles at least from a known civilian air route. And that avoids all of these diversions. Now, we don't know exactly where the Chinese task group was, and we don't know exactly how close they were to a civilian air route. But I would submit that if 49 aircraft had to be diverted, which is what Air Services Australia told Senate estimates in Australia last week, then likely they were too close, so well within that 10 nautical miles or 18 k's of a known civilian air route, and so their safety trace that they would have put a warning out about overlapped that civilian air route and forced the diversions. That itself warrants some sort of diplomatic conversation between Australia and China in terms of that disruption. I think it's important to note, though, as much as that does warrant a diplomatic conversation, aircraft divert for all sorts of reasons all the time. It's not uncommon for aircraft to have to divert. And to be honest, if you look at it at the chart of the aircraft diversions, they're really minor diversions that we're actually talking about, right? We're not saying that these aircraft had to go to Sydney via Brisbane or something like that. The second element was the question of notice. So certainly, most ships operating in their own exercise areas, exclusive economic zones, Australian ships, for example, would certainly provide notice to Air Services Australia, generally 24 to 48 hours of some sort of firing, and a notice to airmen would be issued. That isn't an obligation on the high seas, and that's not something the warships would traditionally do on the high seas. Now, it depends a lot with where you're operating, what countries are around you, all that sort of stuff, right? It is a little bit contextual. What we do know from the warnings is that the Chinese warships issued warnings on the International Civil Aviation Emergency Circuit, which in military terms we would call GUARD, and that's pretty common. So when you're doing one of these serials, normally a couple of hours beforehand, depending on your standard operating procedures, you would issue a warning on that circuit, telling all aircraft, and also a warning on VHF telling all ships that you intend to conduct a gunnery serial. You would then issue a warning at the start of the serial, and then frequently, say, every 30 minutes during the serial. You'd also fly Flag Bravo for those of you that are excited about flags, which is a red flag with a dove. I'm not excited about flags, but a red flag with a dovetail, right? Which lets the ships also know in the area. Now, what we know from Senate estimates last week, it was quite a timely set of estimates for Australia. We know that the first that Australia knew of this firing, which again, we've got to note was 340 nautical miles from Australia, so well outside Australia's exclusive economic zone. The first that we knew about it was a Virgin aircraft detected the warning from the Chinese warship, let Air Services Australia know, and Air Services Australia told Defence. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for that. One, it could be that China issued their warnings too late. And that, again, does certainly warrant diplomatic representation. It could also be, potentially, that there were no civilian aircraft in the area when China issued their warnings, because they are in the middle of the Tasman, right? They're not close to the coast. And the first it was detected was when the Virgin aircraft actually came within UHF range and heard the warning. So both of those are plausible scenarios, but either way, it certainly warrants a diplomatic conversation. What is not a requirement, though, is to tell coastal states some 300 nautical miles away that they intend to do this. Now, again, you would potentially like to think that our relationship was friendly enough that they would give us a heads up, but if it was that friendly, then they wouldn't circumnavigate Australia without coming in for a port visit. Right? So I think there's some of the mechanics around that we kind of need to understand in the furor. And I think some of the responses in Australia in terms of this is a threat to Australia, or this is a rehearsal of a land strike on Australia, or all of these things were just a little bit farcical, prompted a good debate, but it created some unnecessary anxiety. So that's my summary of the firing. It's probably too long, but I think it's important. If you're interested in the details, there is a blog on my website that kind of breaks this down a little bit more. In my defense, it was written in 30 minutes, so it's not Pulitzer Prize winning, but it does talk about gunnery serials. Anyway, what's your take on the live firing?
I would definitely recommend have a look at the blog. It's really good for sort of actually setting out some of the basics and kind of cutting through some of the hype that has gone on around this.
Thank you.
I think absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying. I think that there is a misunderstanding about in quite a lot of the public debate about what these things are. I think I would also venture to suggest that perhaps that misunderstanding has been fueled by certain elements who are quite keen at the moment to be talking about national security and effectively trying to present the government as being weak on national security. The idea that we should sort of have a full diplomatic response to China in terms of actually taking some kind of action in response to this and you then push and say, well, in response to what? But that kind of doesn't ever resonate. So I think there's been a lot of politics played with this. Obviously, with the fact that Australia is coming very close to an election cycle, and there's been quite a lot of party politics in this. I did say in the piece I wrote, and I think it is true. One of the things that's been a little not frustrating, but noteworthy to me is that there have been a number of statements, whether it was by Admiral Chris Barry on ABC Radio National, or a number of articles by yourself and others, by naval officers saying basically this is actually not that unusual. None of that really cut through into the kind of mainstream media debate. It's one of those things where perhaps it would be useful if we empowered some of our senior officers and defence officials a little bit more to be able to speak and communicate with the public on defence matters, rather than letting everything go through the politicians, at which point it automatically becomes politicised. Now, I appreciate there's always challenges within that, but we know that in Australia, we are incredibly reticent about letting serving personnel speak to the press on anything, even if it is something where actually kind of real expertise would benefit the wider debate. And I think a little bit more willingness to engage the press and the public from defence would not have done any harm in this particular situation. But yeah, that's where we're at, I think.
Look, I agree. Although I do want to say, slightly tangentially, a big shout out to the commanding officer of HMAS Chul's, Commander Aaron Conver, who was on Sunrise this morning, talking about Chul's rescue of the rower, and well done, Chul's, to that. So yes, I think that Defence kind of picked up on this in terms of with respect to the Chinese task group, and actually since about the 28th of February, there has been a morning update on the Defence website in terms of the position of the Chinese task group, which I think right now is about 170 nautical miles south-southwest of Perth. But I agree with you. I mean, I've often said, I completely agree with your piece and conversation, and I've often said I think that some sort of defence spokesperson who is identified, not just unnamed defence official, who does explain these things would be really beneficial. And I actually think in the event of a crisis or conflict, crucial. In the same way that when we have, a natural disaster, and unfortunately, as you mentioned, we're recording this on Tuesday, the 4th of March, and northern New South Wales and southern Queensland is unfortunately about to get hit with a cyclone. We see in these circumstances that we see SES personnel giving these briefs. In the event of bushfires, we see fire brigade personnel giving these briefs. So I think that Defence could benefit from that. Look, I do wonder in terms of the timing of the deployment. Look, certainly the deployment was aimed at sending a message. I mean, Australia's not on its way to anywhere. You don't go and circumnavigate Australia unless you want to send a message. Although I think it's interesting that they didn't go through the Bass Strait, by the way. That would have been really sending a message. But look, I think that the timing is clearly aimed at our election. If you look back to the 2022 election, China and Solomon Islands announced their agreement during our 2022 election. So I think that this is part of messaging which is conveniently timed about the lead up to Australian elections.
Just picking up on that, because I think your point is obviously right. It's clearly designed to send a signal, and Australia is not on the way to anywhere. But I would push back slightly, and I know this is not your line of argument, but the argument which has come out from a number of people, which is that, yes, this deployment is legal, but they don't need to be here, and therefore it's a problem. And this idea somehow that you need a third party or another state to acknowledge your deployment or transit is a necessity in order for it to be okay is obviously a deeply problematic. China would say that none of the deployments in places like the South China Sea are necessary, and therefore they would run sort of the same narrative back on us. And it's very quickly going to be a route to sort of undermine both UNCLOS, so the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, and the wider rules-based international order at sea, both of which serve Australia very well. So I think whilst absolutely they're trying to send a signal, of course they are, that's literally one of Navy's jobs in peacetime, right, is to do this kind of naval diplomacy. There's a whole literature on it if you want to go and read it. The idea that we can push back on this because they don't need to be here, I think is a very dangerous path to go down.
So I completely agree with you, and I think there was a good op-ed by Christopher Pyne, the former Defence Minister, in the Sydney Morning Herald, potentially yesterday. I am still jet lagged, so I don't actually know what day it is, and I'm about to get on a plane to Perth. But at some point in the last 2 days, which I'd recommend, that really talks about this point, right? And it was good to see it from a former Defence Minister as well. And I think, Australia can't be the country that says, we support the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in every statement we make about the South China Sea, and then get upset when warships operate within our exclusive economic zone. And I think, to the government's credit, the government was very quick to point out in all of its press statements that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was really important. There was another aspect of this which I'm interested to get your take on. We won't labour it too much, but there was this furor about, is there a nuclear-powered submarine operating with this task group, which I found mildly amusing. Now, the Chief of Defence Force was asked the question at Senate estimates, and he said that he could neither confirm nor deny, which is what you would exactly expect as a response in an unclassified environment of Senate estimates. But I thought it highly amusing in terms of, yes, it is true that some major task groups, so certainly carrier strike groups, do deploy with submarines. When I'm talking carrier strike groups, I'm talking about US carrier strike groups. There is some reporting that UK carrier strike groups, when they deploy, also do. Obviously, depending on how many submarines they've got operational, they don't have that many. But this idea that a Chinese task group of 2 ships and a tanker, which was clearly designed to not be, I mean, it was meant to be, it was meant to send a message, but it wasn't designed to be provocative, because actually you would send much more capability if you were trying to do that. And you'd go through the Bass Strait, to be honest. That would have been accompanied by a submarine. And that we somehow didn't have the underwater domain awareness knowledge to know it was there. And I just think this is an interesting one. I find it highly farcical that would be the case. Now, of course, I don't know, but the idea, so ship and submarine coordination is actually really, really difficult. It's actually really difficult to be able to deploy and coordinate with a submarine, which is why most navies don't do it, and submarines operate by themselves. So I thought this was an interesting thing that I saw getting pushed. It was reported on by the ABC, and then it was pushed a lot on social media to kind of big up the threat. What was your take on that?
So in terms of whether or not that there is, we don't know. I certainly don't know. I don't know Chinese operating sort of practice in this kind of way, or even if there is really any, because as I say, and we've sort of highlighted, these larger deployments of this type are still relatively new for the PLA-N. I guess the point, yes, the Americans do. The Russians also do with often with more things like this. A surface action group will often have a submarine operating with them, and there was one a little while ago operating off the east coast of the United States. So it's certainly not that unusual. Both the Brits and the French, when they come out into the Indo-Pacific, tend to come out with a submarine as well. So in that respect, it's not sort of beyond the realms of possibility. The Chinese don't have very many SSNs, and obviously this could not be a diesel-electric submarine. It would have to be a nuclear-propelled submarine. So they don't have very many. So it would certainly be a big sort of statement if they did decide to do this. I think, again, perhaps what's more relevant and interesting is less the whether or not they have this time. It's the fact that the Chinese are now building more SSNs. They are going to have a much larger fleet into the future, and the likelihood of some of them operating in our neck of the woods in the next 10, 15 years is actually going to be quite high. So I think, again, as with so much of this, there's all of the heat and the noise around the sort of specifics of what's happening, and certain former departmental secretaries suggesting that missiles might be flying at Canberra and Sydney anytime soon, and sort of talk of invasion. Actually, the interesting side of things is what this says about what's going to happen going forward in terms of the growth of Chinese capability and their increasing willingness to deploy into our region.
So I agree with you. I would just caveat, though, those deployments that you mentioned to the Indo-Pacific normally are large task group, big deck deployments, not 2 ships and a tanker. So I do, not to diminish, got a lot of time for tankers, but hey,
you do in Australia at the moment, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. But I find it unlikely that an SSN is accompanying 2 ships and a tanker down to the Southern Ocean. And if you're trying to send a message with an SSN, then, as the US have increasingly started to do, then you surface it, right? In this view that, it's just collecting intelligence. Well, it's not collecting that much intelligence. So anyway, but we'll move on to that. What do you think we should take away from this 3-week sojourn of Chinese ships around Australia? And where do you think, if any, have been some of the pinch points or the testing of Australian capability? And we did just mention tankers, which we can't not talk about.
We can't not talk about tankers. So the obvious point here is that, as I said, this is not a particular threat. I don't think that any kind of discussion in that sort of way is appropriate. But one thing that you want to be able to do with this kind of thing is you want to be able to shadow them and basically have a vessel with them at all times when they're operating in the waters, sort of certainly within your EEZ, but more broadly within the waters that you would sort of consider to be kind of your backyard, I guess, in kind of colloquial terms. And this is absolutely common practice. The Brits do it all the time with Russian vessels. So do the French, so do the Americans, and if you see this, as I say, absolutely all the time. And the Chinese were doing the same with the most recent MMCA in the South China Sea. There was a Chinese frigate in the background in quite a lot of the American pictures that were released. Interestingly, not in the Australian pictures that were released, but that's a slight aside. So that is absolutely what you would expect it to be able to do. Now that's going to be quite a significant drain. If this happens regularly, it's going to be quite a significant drain on Australian resources to be able to do this. And that, again, comes back to the point that we make, and you make in particular, ad infinitum on this podcast, which is how many surface combatants do we have? From the statements, I think, that were made in Senate estimates, there have been 2 Australian ANZAC class that have been involved in shadowing this task group, and they've been supported by a Kiwi ANZAC and a Kiwi tanker, as well as P-8 aircraft doing the same sort of thing. Now, that's in terms of the combined Australian and New Zealand naval force. That's quite a hefty chunk, right? So you're talking quite a significant commitment, and if this starts to happen regularly, it becomes much more of a pressing commitment. And obviously, the other point, and I've not seen this absolutely confirmed, but certainly the implication has been that the Kiwi tanker has been supporting the Australian vessels as well as the Kiwi one.
It was on Defence social media. Photos of Stuart and Aotearoa, pronounced poorly. Sorry to our New Zealand listeners, undertaking a replenishment.
Fine. So again, this comes back to the point we've made before, and we had a bit of a crack at about earlier. Both Australian replenishment ships are currently out of service. Both of them have mechanical issues. As such, we are having to rely very heavily on allies and partners for that. That is not a good state of affairs to be in. That's my take.
No, it's not. Look, and I completely agree with you. So we certainly know from the defence reporting that Arunta met the task group in the Coral Sea. At least that was on defence reporting, and then Stuart picked them up and certainly accompanied them. It seems to be around Hobart. Who is there now? It's not entirely clear, but it is important to show that presence. And I think we can't move past the fact that I know our listeners might be sick of hearing it, but 10 service combatants for Australia is just not enough, and that'll be 9 in 2026 under the current plans. And this is a big problem. I've recently, for my overdue PhD chapter, been reading a lot about the Onslow plan and the Henderson plan, which we will probably do a Did You Know at some point about some of these kind of maritime strategies from the lead up to World War One and then after World War One about how do you defend Australia. And even at that point, so this is around the time of the formation of the Royal Australian Navy and then going on a decade and a bit, there's a lot of conversation about how many ships does it take. And people say, but, capabilities evolve, technology evolves, and that's all true. But certainly when you think about naval warfare and naval operations, quantity really, really does matter. And so I think that this is a challenge for Australia that we really can't understate. And kind of talking of that challenge, I guess probably it's worthwhile moving on to C3000, which is Australia's plan to address its limited surface combatants, so 10 surface combatants. C3000, of course, the Future Frigate program for Australia, or I get confused because the Hunter class used to be called the Future Frigate program.
General purpose frigate.
This is the general purpose frigate, although the Hunter class is also a general purpose frigate. But anyway.
But is it? Was it an ASW frigate? We're not going to go down the rabbit hole. So let's get back to C3000.
Right, C3000. So I guess, we talked a bit about Senate estimates last week. For those of you watching, Senate estimates happens in Australia about 3 times a year. It's where senior officials from various departments, but we're specifically interested in the Department of Defence, are quizzed from Australian senators. And it can be quite comical. It can be quite depressing. I feel sorry for the officials that have to go through it. But what did we learn about C3000 last week in Senate estimates, Richard?
So the expectation had been that we would have the final selection. So at the moment it was down selected from 4 potential sort of designs to 2. This is the German TKMS Miko design and the Japanese, what's now become the upgraded Mogami class frigate. And we were expecting a decision on this in the second half of this year. And then both the Deputy Secretary, Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment and his sort of deputy both stated that actually because of additional work that needs to be done in terms of the response to tendering, etc., they were now not expecting the final decision to come until Q1 2026. Now, this matters because the whole point of this was it was supposed to be an incredibly rapid process. They weren't going to do the upgrades on the Anzac class frigates that were originally intended to do as part of when we had the Surface Fleet Review. They decided to cut the upgrades or the sustainment work to maintenance work to keep the Anzacs in the water because they were going to get this done really fast. And so there's been a lot of questions about that element of this. And then the Deputy Prime Minister, Defence Minister, Richard Marles, came out and basically publicly shot down his senior officials and said, no, we will have a decision in the second half of this year. And he initially made a statement at a press conference, and then a number of journalists picked up on this pretty quickly and contacted his office, and they doubled down on it. So it's quite clear that there's significant disagreement over this within the department, and that suggests sort of certain tensions within this program. And then this morning we heard that Jim McDowell, who's the Deputy Secretary, Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment, is leaving the department. Now, the statement was that this decision had been made some time ago, but it seems likely, or it seems certainly plausible that tensions within this program are kind of very much there and are impacting how the department is going about its business.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. I had a call from a journalist when that statement was made at Senate estimates, and my response was, I just don't think that that's going to stand with the government. And it's a really difficult one, right? Because it is acceleration of a very expensive capability. And it's acceleration of very expensive capability because of no fault of defences that the government hasn't. Successive governments haven't made decisions in appropriate timeframes. And of course, we can have the whole Hunter discussion. We could do a whole podcast on that. It's not quite as black and white as I've just made it sound, but we can park the Hunter discussion for a moment. And so we have gotten to this point where the fleet is, really in some ways at a critical number. I actually had this conversation on Radio New Zealand this week where I was talking about the New Zealand Navy, and they were saying, well, how do they rebuild their Navy? And I was saying, well, one, they need money, but two, really, they've gotten below a critical mass. The only way is to align capabilities with Australia in many ways. And so for Australia is kind of how do we bring this on quickly, but how do we do it without risk? Because whatever you think of Hunter and Arafura, and we can be here all day, certainly the Defence's acquisition of ships has taken a hit in the public psyche about it. And so that is an important element to consider. There is also the risk of, we are really in the most serious strategic circumstances since World War II. I mean, I don't think the government's fluffing when they say that. That's true. It's probably a bit more dramatic than that, to be honest. And we find ourselves at this time where we have, in terms of ships, the oldest, smallest, and I'm going to argue, I know some people disagree with this vehemently, and there was a good piece in the Interpreter by Peter Levy who talks about why it's not the least capable. I would argue it probably is, but you can have a debate. But we find ourselves in this situation at this important strategic time. So there is this rush to how do we address this capability, and so you can see those tensions playing out within the department. And of course, one of the contenders for this capability, the Japanese contender, and there's been a lot written in Aspie's The Strategist in the last week about how it's the only answer. I don't agree it's the only answer. But he's a country who, great capability, great relationship, but not used to exporting this stuff to Australia, to countries like Australia. So you can see how these tensions arise.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, coming back to your point about the size of the surface fleet, the other thing that's quite scary, and I did this for a little workshop that I was at last week, when you actually work out and plot the numbers through until at least the mid-2030s, the surface fleet is not going to grow substantially for quite some time. So even with the kind of rapid acceleration of C-3000, even with all the assumptions that defence are building in, it's still going to be a long time before we see substantial growth in the size of the fleet. Yeah.
And this is where I wonder, and I'm going to be careful because we're prolonging this podcast and we do need to be able to AUKUS. This is where I wonder if, so I've been on TV a little bit this week talking about increasing the defence budget, right? Which I think is a conversation we need to have. And people go, but what's the point of money if you don't address processes? I agree with all of that too, right? But I do think that the issues in terms of the Royal Australian Navy fleet structure, certainly in terms of mine warfare, hydrography, tankers, etc. They actually do come down to budget, right? There just was not enough money for those future programs. So I think it is a conversation around budget. But I do think that if you can increase the budget, I do think there is some opportunity to do some creative things. As much as I had a piece in Aspie's The Strategist about 2 weeks ago about why missile attack boats are not the answer for replacing frigates, I do think we do need to look at what are some short-term answers in terms of capabilities that we can get in quickly. And this is where I think, and don't get me wrong, I don't think this is feasible. Any government is going to agree with this. This is where I think something like, a fast attack boat, some sort of capability that can do some of that work around the islands that has a limited missile capability or close into certain areas of the Australian coast around the Torres Strait, for example, could be a quick thing to purchase. Not to replace a frigate, but to address some of those immediate vulnerabilities. And I would love to start having a conversation about what we could do in that space. I don't think we're doing that.
No, No. Anyway, as you say, we're running over. AUKUS. The comment. Do you want to talk briefly about Trump's comment and your views?
Look, so there was a journalist. I can't remember all the details and who it was. It seemed to be a little bit set up. There was a journalist that asked Trump during a press conference when he was with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, what did he think about AUKUS? I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and Trump's response was, "What is that?" And of course, the Australian media, and lots of Australian commentators latched onto it. Like it's a funny anecdote. It makes some good press. Then, of course, came the furor of, well, the US aren't serious about AUKUS, etc., etc. But I should note that once President Trump seemed to realise what AUKUS was, he did then double down on how important the relationship was with Australia. And we actually saw some of the strongest commentary we have seen from the new US administration on the importance of the relationship with Australia. So it doesn't really...
I would, however, note that he did not double down on AUKUS. He doubled down on the relationship with Australia.
Well, that's because you didn't know what it was.
That certainly is the implication. But yes, he did have some very positive words to say about Australia.
He did. Look, I stand by the comments that I've made about AUKUS for, I don't know, the last 2 years. I think that there's, even if you take the view that the new US administration's approach to alliances is transactional, which I don't necessarily take that view. I think you can take too many lessons from the US-Europe relationship and try and apply them to the US-Australia relationship, which is fundamentally different. But even if you do take that view, then there is a lot in this deal for the US. So I don't think anything has fundamentally changed when it comes to AUKUS whatsoever. What's your take?
So I must say I'm increasingly of a slightly different view, not necessarily purely about AUKUS, but about the Australian relationship. And I've kind of been on this path for a while, but I think that there needs to be some significant thought within Australia more broadly, and about the relationship with the United States, and it's the way in which it is the absolute bedrock of defence and foreign policy, and the way I framed it, and I said this to I was talking to the War College last week, which is that we often, one of the kind of go-to phrases of the national security community is that we're paid to be pessimistic. And whenever we talk about kind of hawkish positions on China, invariably this comes out, and it came out relatively recently. Hugh Jeffrey talked quite a lot about this in a podcast he did for the ANU National Security College. Really good podcast, definitely have a listen. But I just really struggle to see how we can make the case that we are being hawkish or anything other than extremely optimistic on where we might end up with the United States. Now, I'm not saying that everything's going to fall apart. I don't necessarily think it is. But if we say that this is the absolute bedrock of everything that we do, it increasingly looks like we're taking some significant gambles. In terms of Trump's actual statements about AUKUS, in many ways, I think actually it's quite a good thing. I think the more AUKUS can stay below the kind of the political maelstrom that is the White House and stay within the officials in Washington, the kind of the bureaucracy, I think that the safer it is. It has quite a lot of support within that kind of Washington bureaucracy, because I think it is in many ways a sensible, logical deal, and the Americans are getting quite a lot out of it. I think it's actually far more dangerous if it becomes politicized and then gets to be a kind of potentially a card in some kind of transactional relationship. So in some ways, I think actually Trump not knowing anything about it is probably a good thing. But maybe that's being a sort of a step too far down the cynicism line. But that was kind of my take.
I agree. I actually agree with you predominantly on the alliance aspect, just in terms of the fact that I think that whatever your fundamental assumptions are that underpin your defense strategy, you should constantly revisit those assumptions, right? And you need to be responding to the changing environment. And I do think, in a way, in the last 20 years, kind of since 9/11, to be honest, we have really doubled down in the US alliance in a way that we hadn't necessarily before. Now, people might use the Vietnam example, etc., but I think in some ways we had a little bit more of this idea of self-reliance within the alliance, and that there were certain tasks and functions that we would make sure that we were capable of doing independent of that US relationship. I think in some ways that has eroded in the last 20 years, certainly in terms of our investment in defence and therefore our capabilities and the tasks that those capabilities can undertake. And so I think that certainly we should continue to keep an eye on what is changing and make sure we are revisiting these assumptions. I mean, certainly, you're a historian, I'm not. But if you go back to kind of the lead up to World War II, there are a lot of signposts about how much support Great Britain was going to be able to provide Australia, right? And some of those signposts were potentially missed. We won't get into that. That's another episode as well. So I agree with you. I'm kind of in the place right now that I'm not sure that I am personally seeing those signposts or those red flags that mean that those assumptions should be fundamentally revisited right now. And I think that some people are arguing that the relationship between US and Ukraine, US and Europe are those signposts. And I just think they're fundamentally different relationships.
I think that maybe that's one for another podcast.
It is. All right, we better wrap this up. So look, thanks so much, Richard. It's been a great discussion. Really focused on Australia today.
Well, that's good in some ways. We often talk about other places, right? We can come back.
We can. And maritime obviously really matters in Australia in the last week. So thanks so much for your time.
Certainly has. Cheers then, Jen.